Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. Can I just get a
Hello.
confirmation, Angie, that you can hear me okay?
Yes, dear.
Very
Yes.
good.
So I just wanted to say a few words.
Sure,
Hello,
of
ladies
course.
and gentlemen. Welcome to the first compliance webinar for this year. We are glad to have you attending this important topic. Our expert trainer, Mr. Michael Richardson, will be with you and he will explain the managing compliance risk to accelerate growth in a post-pandemic world. Please note that all of you are muted, so we won't face any background noise. Michael, feel free to start in any time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie. Good afternoon, good evening. Where I am, it is morning. I am in Montreal, Canada. I am so excited to be with all of you today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Like Angie said, this is a very important topic, and we're seeing this becoming increasingly relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, what we're seeing more and more is that as companies and as industries, and I would even say as governments, tend to start preparing themselves for a post-COVID-19 relaunch, we're seeing that compliance risk is at that is becoming a strategic pillar of what this relaunch plan is going to be. For example, just this past year, I was part of our city's economic relaunch, and part of that definitely has a risk compliance side to it. So that's why this type of topic is becoming increasingly important, especially in the last year or so. So the content that I'll cover today, ladies and gentlemen, will last about 45 minutes to 1 hour. So we will have plenty of time for Q&A, questions and answers at the end of the presentation today. I do want to say, please do not hesitate. Ask all of the questions you want. I love having the questions. I've given this training several times with LEORON and with others. It's so important to have all of your questions answered. Compliance risk is a complex topic, a very complex topic. And as a result, we want to be sure that all of your questions are answered. For those of you that are going to ask, this is snow behind me. So it is minus 10 degrees Celsius here in my home in Montreal. So I definitely miss the sun and the heat of other parts of the world. That is for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Partager du contenu, écran numéro 1. Okay. Okay, it says that I am sharing the screen. Okay. Great. And we're going to keep the questions until the very end, so please feel free to put them in the chat, and then Angela will keep me honest here. Angela will be sure that I am answering all of your questions by the end of the webinar today. So I like to start with this major question every time we start talking about compliance risk. And I ask, how long did it take to build a pyramid? And there was a French researcher from France that had done a study a few years ago, and they said, well, if we assume that it took about 4,000 workers, more or less 20 years or so, and let's say they only worked 261 days a year. Let's say they took Friday and Saturday off. Let's say they had vacation, hypothetically, of course, and let's say they only worked 8 hours per day. Again, we're being very generous here with the timing, but let's just say for the sake of the argument today. If they're using sleds, ropes, and just their brute human strength, the estimated time to complete a pyramid 4,500 years ago is about 167 million hours of work. And you might sit back in your chair and you say, wow, that's extremely long. Of course, it's a wonder of the world. But if we were to fast forward until today, how would that change? Well, today we have cranes, we have helicopters, we have several more and several better tools. And if we have vehicles and trucks and cars to ship sand and to ship rock, and cranes to lift it, and helicopters to bring products from one place to the other, and the other tools that we have, it would take half the people, 2,000 workers, 5 years, so a quarter of the time, and the same 261 days. Let's say we're still going to give people Friday and Saturday off and 8 hours per day. We estimate that in today's time, with today's tools, the estimate would be just about 21 million hours of work. So of course, we're going quickly in time here, but that's an 87% time savings. And why are we able to save so much? Because we have better tools. And the same thing applies to compliance risk. Strong compliance is just another tool to accelerate business success. And I think this is particularly true in the past couple of months as we've been seeing countries and entire industries come out of the pandemic, or at least try to come out of the pandemic. Strong compliance is going to be at the forefront of what this relaunch will need to cover. And so that's why it's such an important topic. And that's why I really thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today and going through these important issues. Now, if we go to from the GCC sector in particular, right? So we see that over the past couple of years or so, of course, there's been an oil price. I wouldn't necessarily say an oil price bubble, but we've been seeing favorable oil prices over the past 10 years or so. And of course, for several reasons, the COVID-19 pandemic being one of them, oversupply being another, drop of demand, etc. Clearly, there has been a catastrophic decline in 2020. There's been a 90% drop, excuse me, in some markets of the price of 1 barrel of crude oil. And the issue is that the reality is the GCC region in particular is still overly dependent on the oil sector. And the sudden worldwide drop in demand because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of other elements as well, has caused a significant shock across the entire GCC region. KSA, for example. Well, if I can just ask Hara, please, if you don't mind just muting yourself. Let's see if we can. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So the dual shock of the COVID-19 pandemic and the drop in oil prices have caused catastrophic losses across the GCC. KSA, unfortunately, leading here in losses, about 261 million US dollars per day in crown revenues that are lost. Kuwait number 2 with 100 million per day, UAE, Qatar, and Oman following thereafter. And it is a challenge. And the reason why I like to show this graph is because, and my colleague Mohammed from LEORON says it best, is it really because the COVID-19 pandemic was just so catastrophic? Of course, yes, there is part of that for sure. But the one question that we always seem to ask ourselves, could compliance have helped mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19? If we had a strong governance, risk, and compliance, GRC framework, and let's say we were to invest 10%, 20, 25% of the economic impact, the losses of COVID-19, I'm willing to bet that the economic shock would not have been as good, as great, I should say. And that's why compliance risk management is so key to a strong restart. Compliance risk can come in many forms, and we're going to see some of them today. Some of them, of course, are regulatory, but other are just, complying with internal financial laws, hedging risks. There's all types of things that compliance can tackle. It is not just compliance with the law. And if we were to have strong compliance risk management throughout sectors, throughout regions, I would suspect that we would have been better prepared to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic than we are today. And I would even say in my country, for example, we are still playing catch up. We are still having, those half measures. Schools are open 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week. Small measures like that. But as a result, we're not developing strong risk management practices. We're just playing catch up. And if we're just playing catch up, I'm of the opinion that I don't think we're ever going to be really prepared for the next COVID-19. In the past 20 years, we had H1N1, H1N3, we had the Ebola outbreak, we had We had COVID-19. There's so many pandemics. This happens every 15, 20 years or so. We have something similar. Of course, this one is a once in a century pandemic. I don't want that to be lost on anyone, of course. But I do think strong compliance could be a saving grace for future pandemics. Now, before I go on to the following slides, I do want to say, of course, my general disclaimer that I provide. Everything in this presentation deck, I want to thank LEORON for asking me to present their content here, but everything is for illustration purposes only. We're going to go through several case studies over the next 50 minutes or so. All parties are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law or equal jurisdiction, and of course, these are just for illustrative purposes only. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic obviously has impacted everybody. 89% of businesses have suffered at least a minor financial hit in the industries that I work in here in Canada, and 35% is the estimate of businesses that will never reopen. In my economy, for example, in my area, I would probably say 60 to 70% of businesses, of employment is small to medium-sized businesses. And if you have 35% of companies that will just never see the light of day again, it definitely provides a little bit of a shock here. Of course, we want to be sure that everyone's healthy, that everyone's safe to go to work. At the same time, there's also that economic impact here of the COVID pandemic that we need to consider, and that I'm sure is similar in all of your sectors and in all of your countries as well. And there are a couple of case studies and examples that I like to point to here. So first, we see obviously the COVID crisis exposed what financial reforms missed. And these are the financial reforms, I mean, Basel III, I mean the improvements to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Dodd-Frank, et cetera, after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, particularly in the United States. And regulators, after that economic collapse, sat back in their chairs and said, you know what? We did not have the strong compliance structure in place. We did not have enough regulations in place in order to protect financial markets, and as a result, to protect consumers and to communicate and to promote trust in the entire financial system here. And the COVID crisis exposed some of the gaps that were still left behind, even through the implementation of the new Basel, even after the implementation of Dodd-Frank, even after the implementation of new provisions to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and of course, other regulations and compliance frameworks throughout the entire world here. So we're already seeing, for example, in KSA and UAE alone, there have been several new laws implemented since the start of the COVID pandemic related to data privacy, related to anti-terrorism funding, anti-money laundering, for example, between royal decrees, between court rulings, between rulings from the DIFC in Dubai, SAMA in the KSA. There are so many trends that are accelerating. And I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated a regulator's view to compliance and how important proper compliance monitoring systems, proper compliance training is for all sectors, but especially now, even for regulators, more so than before. And the reality is compliance is complex, right? That is not lost on any of us. I'm sure many of you, for example, work in compliance. I've been doing compliance for about 10 years or so, both from an internal control standpoint, from a financial analysis standpoint, external audit, internal audit, compliance management, financial crime, and now I work a lot with lawyers and with the courts to investigate fraud. And we see that every single day I go to work, and compliance is a completely different monster. It's a very complex topic, and it's important that all of us have the proper tools in place, not just to build a proper compliance system, but to help us build our compliance pyramid. Now, that's a very long introduction, but I think it's important to set the stage for what we're going to cover today. There are three major objectives that I'd like to share. First, balancing trust and business development. We always speak about, for example, lots of the banks that I work with say, we have our branch staff, our salespeople that want to maximize volume, that want to maximize profitability. But as a result, sometimes we see reports have cut corners. Compliance rules are not always respected. We do have some compliance violations that we've been flagged by our regulators, for example. So I want to talk about some of the compliance failures and why trust and business development really go hand in hand. The second major objective, ladies and gentlemen, I want to speak about compliance as a strategic imperative. Everyone's saying COVID-19 is not going to last forever. I am very hopeful of that as well. But we have to be ready to restart our business and to restart our sectors. And compliance is a strategic imperative that will allow us to do that. And then finally, how do we build a compliance culture? I am of the opinion that compliance is not a department, it is a culture, right? Compliance is a culture, not a department. And we're going to go through a few examples of why compliance culture, or a lack thereof, led to strategic issues, led to brand erosion, and how we can make sure that your business is set up for success following the COVID-19 relaunch. Now, let's get into that very first section here, balancing trust and business development. Now, COVID-19 or not, risk has always been part of business, and risk is here to stay. And when we speak about risk, we speak about, of course, legal risk that compliance management can help prevent. So here we're speaking about fines and penalties, imprisonment brought by regulators to the company or to the employees. For example, just in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a huge improvement in Dubai's regulatory framework around penalties and imprisonment for executives that are guilty of fraud or are guilty of collusion, for example. It used to only be civil penalties for the organization. Now, the executives themselves might be being held liable. And the same is happening in Kuwait, in the KSA, for example, to a certain extent as well. And I am of the opinion that companies can afford penalties. I've worked with so many money laundering reporting officers and chief compliance officers over the years that have said, you know, I have worked in a previous company, or my competitor says that a fine, a penalty, is just part of the budget line. And that cannot be the way that it works. Fines and penalties cannot be just another expense that the company has to incur. There needs to be a strategic view of legal risk management here, and compliance is part of that. Financial risk. So compliance, for example, like I said earlier, compliance is always seen to be related to legal risk, regulatory risk management. But the firm, the company, your organization might have several policies in place to mitigate financial risk. Maybe you have hedging instruments that are in place. Maybe you want to diversify your holdings in your portfolio. Financial risk compliance is a key element of the larger compliance umbrella as well. And as COVID-19 starts to impact several sectors and of course almost every country on the planet, we're seeing that compliance umbrella grow to cover things like legal risk, but also financial risk, business risk as well. Certain companies, for instance, will put organizational strategies in place to prevent domino effects. One of the manufacturing companies that I've worked with in the past, they manufacture a particular good across Latin America, across Asia. And the reason why they do it in two different regions is exactly to mitigate against something like COVID-19. When the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, I'm not even sure what the proper term is at this point, but when COVID was hitting Asia first, the Asian plants went offline almost overnight. The government shut down their plants in China. The Latin American plants were able to compensate for that decrease in supply from that shut down Chinese plant, for example. And that's an instance of a strong compliance function that is not just managing legal risk, that is not just managing financial risk, but is also managing the organizational and the business risk associated with international logistics here. Another couple of examples here, ladies and gentlemen, talent risk. We're seeing this increasingly becoming a key priority in the time of COVID. Of course, not everyone is looking to jump ship and to change jobs. However, in a climate where top talent is hard to find, key personnel, strong talent, top talent, tend to avoid organizations that do not have a strong reputation. And generally, and many of the examples that we'll see over the course of the next couple of minutes are instances where there was a weak compliance culture, a weak compliance function, leading to a reputational risk. Like I said earlier, some of the regulations that we put into place, or not we, but regulators have put into place over the past 15 years or so, are really about reinforcing that image of trust. If people do not have trust in the markets will never be able to be sustainable in the long run. Similarly, if a consumer or a customer does not have trust in your business, if you don't have a proper compliance structure in place to avoid that reputational risk, you will eventually fail in the long run. I have never met anybody that said, you know what, we have spent too much on compliance and our business is failing as a result. There has been no client that I've ever worked with, no person, no company that I've ever been in contact with that said, you know why our business failed? Because we were too compliant. Of course, compliance, there are costs associated with it, but it's a strategic investment. And we're going to see that in Objective 2 when we look at it today. And the reason why we're seeing difficulties in balancing business development and trust is because too many organizations across the world and across sectors have become compliance complacent. Now, we used to talk about all the time that the tone at the top, right? The tone at the top are the people that are charged with governance, the senior management, the senior executives, and the board of directors and the committees. Well, it was their job to be in charge of compliance. It was their job to oversee the compliance function. But we're seeing more and more, particularly since the start of COVID, many companies are just collapsing because senior leaders and board members have simply not taken care of setting compliance strategies for the entire firm. Now, are they going to start taking care of internal control? Are they going to be writing policies? Are they going to be working with the AML function? Of course not. No, there's a compliance function that hopefully will take care of that on behalf of management, on behalf of the board. But it's still the board and senior leadership's responsibility to set that strategy and to make sure the compliance strategy is actually being respected. Second, there's often a misalignment between compliance targets and company targets. I see all the time, particularly in large financial institutions and large commodity organizations, especially in the hydrocarbon sector, where business objectives do not include compliance targets. For example, one of the things that I like to recommend when I'm building a compliance strategy or compliance function for one of our clients is that it is not just about maximizing profits or maximizing transaction volume for a sales rep, but you need to be sure that you have, in the first year, for example, 3 minor compliance violations, then next year 2 violations, then next year 1, and then eventually dragging that down to 0, particularly if you are a largely non-compliant organization. There needs to be a way to balance trust and balance business development, and setting compliance targets as a driver of business development is a part of that conversation. The third thing that we like to talk about, a lack of accountability. We always see that the reporting form is too long. I'm just going to close my eyes. I'm not going to report it. Or, well, it's my very good friend. I don't want to get her. I don't want to get him in trouble. As a result, I'm not going to report it. And because of that lack of accountability, we're seeing repeated inappropriate behavior, particularly when it comes to compliance violations here. We often see number 4, compliance as a box ticking exercise. We're seeing more and more that compliance is a chore rather than a true business partnership. And as a result, that leads to an outdated compliance mindset. We have old tools, for example. We have so many organizations, and I'm sure many of you have seen this as well, that are trying to manage their compliance risk inventory with an Excel sheet, for example, or with paper copies and paper policies that they're trying to manage in a filing cabinet. COVID-19 has accelerated the importance of compliance management, and we need to have better tools. We need to be investing in GRC tools. We need to be investing in compliance tracking software, in RegTech, for example, and all of these different types of tools that will help build our compliance pyramid. And as a result, we've seen several compliance failures, even before the pandemic, but that's especially been accelerated since the COVID-19 started, really. And the first one that I like to speak about is Danske Bank. So this really happened in 2017, 18 or so, but it's actually still going on and is still before the courts in certain jurisdictions. And for those of you that might not be familiar with this topic, oh, I see somebody wants to annotate. I'm just going to say no for now, but if you have any questions, I encourage you, sir, to please just write them in the chat. Happy to get to your questions. So in about 2013 or so, there was a whistleblower that had disclosed that one of the Danske Bank's branches in Estonia, in the capital of Tallinn, was dealing with funds for certain members of, or certain family members of certain Russian political figures, for example. And the reality was that these claims were not properly investigated. The whistleblower was kind of put to the side. And over the next 5 years or so, 5, 6 years, there were several instances of just compliance breaches overall. Perfect example. The major driver here was non-resident investment portfolios. And we saw that there were about 35% of the profits of this small Estonian branch of Danske Bank. 35% of the profits were coming from about 8% of the clients that were Russian. So 35% of the profits were coming from Russian clients, even though those clients only represented 8% of the bank's overall volume. And that didn't raise any flags, of course. And there were transactions between Estonia and Cyprus, in the UK, New Zealand, Latvia, Moldova, Russia, and as a result, Azerbaijan as well. And the more regulators started to be mindful of this, the more that they were seeing that the bonus structure, right, that business development spirit, that business development culture was behind the scandal. The major driver of a salesperson's bonus, of a branch employee's bonus, for example, one case, they needed to have 40,000 transactions per year to make their bonus, which was more than double other branches around Europe. And as a result of, things like, this particular branch was seen as open for business. People were seeing, I could just bring my money here, and because I know that this branch employee needs to make a transaction to get their bonus, I can really move my money anywhere. I know that I'm not going to have to be super mindful of compliance restrictions. And we had certain examples where bankers were getting billions of dollars in cash or of gold, for example, to hide some of this money from certain oligarchs as well. Now, one of the other stories that is quite interesting as well, this just happened a few months ago, is Westpac in Australia. And so Westpac, one of their banks, actually negotiated the highest fine, I believe, ever, if I'm not mistaken, of about 1.3 billion Aussie dollars, or about 1 billion US dollars, for the country's biggest breach of money laundering laws. There are about 19 million international transactions, some of which were potentially linked to extremely serious crimes, child exploitations, bribery, corruption, arms trafficking, terrorism trafficking, and financing. And while the company has, of course, apologized for failings, there's over $11 billion of these transactions that were missed and that were not reported. And again, many people allege, and the regulators allege as well, that it was because of a culture of driving business rather than driving trust. And this is a perfect example of how that might work in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. And a stronger compliance function would have been key here. PayPal as well. I like to go to Australia because one of my favorite places. So I have a couple of examples from Australia here. So here, Australia's Financial Intelligence Agency here said that after they ordered an audit of PayPal's holdings, they were seeing that there were several, similarly to Westpac, there were several potential violations of the law here because there was that culture of business development rather than a culture of compliance. And as a result, PayPal was allowing the financing of terrorism financing, allegedly, of course, and because certain reporting obligations were not being met here. And again, I do want to say all parties are innocent until proven guilty in court. Now, one of the favorite examples that I like to point to is Hsbc. And this was, I would say, the biggest story at the time. This goes back to 2012, and we're going to see in a couple of slides why this is still relevant today. So the example here, so HSBC was accused by the U.S. Department of Justice of allowing the financing of the Mexican Sinaloa cartel and the Colombia's del Valle cartel of about 881 million US dollars or so between the HSBC and these cartels. And of course, despite the risks that were in place when dealing with certain areas of Mexico because of the increased risk of drug trafficking and of criminality, for example, the bank still put Mexico in its lowest risk category. The bank, of course, said, okay, this country is going to be high risk, this country is going to be low risk. Mexico was deemed to be one of the low risk countries there. Right away, that should have set off a flag just because of some of the geopolitical and some of the criminality risks associated with that particular geography at the time. But because they had set that risk level to a lower level here, they excluded $670 billion of transactions from the bank's monitoring systems. And as a result, it was just about growing the business and maximizing profits of the Mexican branch. And they were seeing that there were hundreds of millions of dollars of profits coming from a relatively small area of Mexico. And that still didn't raise any flags. All this to say, there was a significant money laundering investigation launched by the U.S. Department of Justice and finally closed in 2012. And there was about a $2 billion fine. It was a significant fine at the time, even though that was about a couple of weeks of the bank's profits. Let's not even get into that discussion for today. But HSBC, 5 years later, they were on probation for 5 years. In 2017 here we see 2017, they say, look, we're going to draw a line in the sand. Their chief executive, Stuart Gulliver, at the time, he said, look, we accept responsibility for our past mistakes. We're very sorry, and we don't want to do that again. And HSBC today is a fundamentally different organization than one that made that mistakes 5 years ago. And everybody was excited about that. They were like, you know what, this is great. Here's a huge international bank that took a significant hit because they were putting business development over trust. And everybody was excited. Now, fast forward, just a few months ago, 20th of September, HSBC was in the news again in the BBC for a Ponzi scheme worth millions of dollars. So Britain's, the largest bank here funneled about $80 million or so US in fraud and didn't report these as suspicious activity. Now, I will say that HSBC claims today that it has always met its legal obligations for these types of reports. And from what I'm understanding, they're still claiming their innocence here. And of course, all parties are innocent until proven guilty. But it just goes to show you that HSBC, once again, is in the news, even though 3 years ago they said, look, we are a fundamentally different organization here. So it really is a structural, a cultural change that is required in some of these organizations. Now, if we take a step back and we ask ourselves, what do all of these different organizations have in common? And I would say that it comes down to one fundamental thing, and that is prioritizing business development, profits, growth over trust and ethics. And it comes down to greed at the end of the day. And I am a fundamental believer that compliance is an effective tool to manage these types of risks. And even though banks spend hundreds of millions of dollars on their compliance functions, having a policy is not enough. It needs to be a strategic imperative. And the reality at the end of the day is that 88% of consumers are going to avoid a company that, in their mind, is seen as not ethical or will not help them make a difference. And we're seeing this more and more, particularly since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. People want to avoid unethical businesses. And so my stance is, look, if you don't want to believe me, if you don't think I know what I'm talking about, look at the data. 88%, to get 88% of people to agree on anything is already a challenge. But if we look at just what does the data show, if we see the large cap index here, which is represented by the black line, And if we look at the 2020 ETHX, which is an ethical portfolio of companies, for example, just to simplify here, if you don't want to spend money on it, if you don't want to believe me, if you don't care that your consumers won't be happy, that's your business. But look at the data. And look at the data here. And the fact that all of you are in this webinar, looking at this, I think is an excellent step, and it's already an accomplishment. And the data does show that if a company is ethical, a portfolio of ethical companies will on average beat the market. 13.5% return premium over the past 5 years alone. And we're seeing a significant jump here right at COVID, which makes sense because people want to prioritize doing business with those ethical companies. Now, of course, balancing trust and business development requires a risk-based approach to compliance. And that's becoming a very hot topic, particularly in the last year or two. And that comes down to, yes, we need our compliance function to help identify inherent risks. So what are just the natural risks that we're going to have to combat just because of the nature of our business? What is our firm's tolerance for risk? What is our risk appetite, and how can we measure that without having a complicated financial mathematical formula, for example? How can we create risk reduction strategies and, of course, document these risk mitigation processes, particularly for high-risk areas? So this is one of the major things that we look at during our 5-day CCP course as well. How do we develop a compliance monitoring system? How do we document controls and monitoring and testing? And of course, how do we document and quantify and calculate risk? How do we evaluate the residual risk? So based on what is our risk tolerance, based on what we are reducing, well, what is the residual risk? How do we actually implement that risk-based approach? So how do we train our people? How do we monitor? How do we test? And of course, how do we continuously review so that we can be sure that our compliance monitoring system is continuously improving, not only as regulations change, but as industry trends change as well. And it comes down to really stakeholder communication. And when I speak about stakeholders here, ladies and gentlemen, I don't mean just shareholders. There used to be such a push for shareholder. And of course, shareholders are extremely important at the top of the list, but there still are other employees that are equal, also at that top. Employees, suppliers, government organizations, communities, neighborhoods. And it comes down to how can we be sure that our compliance strategies are communicated? Well, we have to be sure that we're facilitating access to regulators, but also to people internally to understand our policies and our procedures. We need to engage leaders, and we have to share duties across people around the organization. We have to make sure that we're working with experts. We bring in specialized consultants if we need to. We have to be able to automate incident reporting and focus on training and that continuous development to build a foundation of communication and to build our compliance pyramids. Now, I also want to talk about third-party compliance, and I think this is becoming a significant issue when we speak about an economic relaunch acceleration. And when we speak about third-party compliance, anytime we're working with a vendor, for example, not only do we have to be compliant with our own policies, procedures, and regulations, but we need to be sure that our suppliers and our business partners are also in compliance. And that could be by keeping communication open, by having compliance audits that might be surprise audits, for example, at our supplier's location. How do we make sure that in the contract, we develop terms that ensure compliance is part of the vendor agreement and will trigger a cancellation of that business relationship if there is deemed to be a non-compliance risk? How do we disseminate the policy across the organization? How do we train our suppliers? And of course, how do we benchmark our third-party risk management tools and contracts and protocols against other companies in our industry here? And this is a significant thing that we talk about in the 5-day Certified Compliance Professional course. And I think that really leads in nicely to why compliance is, in my opinion, a strategic imperative and not just something where, okay, we're just going to manage compliance risk. No, we need to fundamentally invest in compliance to accelerate our growth post-COVID, but also to become a strategic pillar here. And again, you don't believe me? I want to look at the data. If we have a survey here that was done by Navex Global Research, what are the top 3 policy management challenges that senior executives are seeing? Well, the first and foremost element that's listed here, keeping policies up to date with new and changing regulations. And that becomes a strategic imperative because it is not enough to say, oh, I'm going to go to an industry conference and they're going to tell us about the new laws, the new industry norms that we will have to be following. No, we need to have a strategic monitoring in place here to be sure that our organization is staying up to date with new and changing regulations, and of course, training employees on those policies here. And if we look at training in a little bit more detail, 60% of people surveyed by StaySafe here surveyed at least one compliance failure in the last year. Particularly, I think this was a health and safety survey. But the point remains, 60% of organizations across industries had at least one compliance failure. And of that 60%, 58% said that the primary driver of that compliance failure is that employees were just unaware of the major rules that were impacting their immediate job function. And that's why training is so important. That's why we focus a lot of the 5-day course on training, development, and monitoring. Now, it's important to say, okay, well, you know what? I have really good people. I have a really good strategic view on my compliance structure. Well, how do I evaluate my regulatory risk, and where do I look for regulatory guidance? And in the past, a lot of it was based on implicit regulation. So the membership in the stock exchange, for example, if you are part of, the IFC, if you are part of, SAMA, for example, that's more of an explicit regulation. But here, by implicit regulation, we're speaking about you're a member of a professional association, or in my industry, there's just this convention that this is what we do in this sector. But ever since, I would say 2008, 2009, but especially since COVID, we're seeing a big push towards explicit and statutory regulations. And this is international standards like the Basel Accords, like the UKFCA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, laws of the Crown as well. So this could be royal decrees, this could be laws in each of your respective countries, statutes, and other enabling legislation. And these are becoming more and more important. And as a result, these change almost every day. I have so every day I get an email from the UK National Governance Association, and it talks about all the major compliance changes that are happening in that day in the one country. Can you imagine if you have an international business and you deal with global laws and global logistics and global partnerships every single day, how fast your compliance function needs to adapt? It is absolutely crazy, particularly in light of COVID-19. And I think as we see an economic relaunch post-COVID, having a strong strategic view to compliance that will allow us to be more adaptable to these explicit and statutory regulatory changes will be key to our success. And as a result, we have an increasing view on global cooperation and common standards. And the reason for that is because we're seeing stronger enforcement. We're seeing common regulatory frameworks like ISO, like the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. This is tackling every industry. This is really multi-sector. This is not just securities, trading, and derivatives like the big focus of 2008, 2009. But we're speaking about insurance products. We're speaking about currency exchanges. We're speaking about commodity swaps. We're speaking about oil and gas. We're speaking about every sector under the sun is subject to these restrictions here. And as a result, regulators have really been becoming more and more sensitive to compliance violations. So, of course, they want to ensure fairness and competitiveness. They want to make sure that we're completing reforms and repairing system cracks, but also monitoring emerging risks. There's a big push here that as markets evolve, threats evolve as well, and regulators need to be able to adapt, and companies with a strategic view to compliance will also be able to adapt as well. And we speak about managing rules and enforcing, ensuring user trust, resolving disputes, and overall protecting the stability of the overall economy here. And at the end of the day, having a strategic view to compliance is not just depending on the regulators to catch violations. We need to have a 360 view of compliance, starting with the board of directors. They're there to ensure, from a consistency standpoint, compliance is a consistent culture around the organization. We understand where we are today, what our current state is, and how to integrate compliance across our people, processes, and technologies across the 3 lines of defense model, which we get to in more detail, of course, on day 2 of the compliance course. And of course, have that 360 holistic view here. And the reason why I like to talk about this, particularly in light of COVID-19, is if we look at the UAE, for example, this was especially the case in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. 4 out of 5 organizations in the UAE faced at least one cyber attack in 2019. 80% of businesses in the UAE suffered at least one cyber attack, and this is only increasing since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if we look at bigger and in more international organizations like Yahoo, for example, if you remember, there was a huge data breach for Yahoo where all of the 3 billion accounts were hacked. Or Equifax, for example, one of the US's large credit reporting agencies, had to pay 600. So it says 650 here. It ended up being closer to 700 million to state, federal, and consumer lawsuits after they had a significant data breach as well. And this is why compliance is such a strategic imperative, because we're not speaking about regulatory compliance, we're speaking about cybersecurity compliance also. We're speaking about organizational and brand risk management as well. And I think this is especially relevant in light of the pandemic. And the way that I like to look at it is, if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. This is a famous quote that everybody that teaches compliance likes to talk about. This is from the former U.S. Deputy Attorney General in the United States. If you think compliance is expensive, and it is, try non-compliance. Try being caught and spending billions of dollars in fines or losing millions of customers because you don't want to, or because they don't want to be associated to a company that had a breach or had a violation of an ethics rule, for example. So here we talk about how will the compliance function change in a post-pandemic world. So of course, we have to be sure that there are rules that we're going to follow, but also a huge and more close collaboration, a closer collaboration with risk management. Compliance historically was often under the legal function, or it was often under the risk function. Now we're seeing more and more compliance functions that are straight reporters to the board and to those charged with governance. And as a result, there needs to be a better collaboration with the risk function and with the legal function as well. When I see that businesses are trying to restart and really want to be sure that they're using compliance as a strategic imperative, of course, I do see that 5 major things are going to continue to be the same. Compliance is going to be responsible for helping to identify the major risks that a company faces. Again, not just regulatory risk, but talent, organizational, reputational, and business. Compliance will be responsible for implementing procedures as a prevention tactic. There's going to still be a huge push towards monitoring and reporting and resolution of non-compliance. But what I think we're going to see a big push towards is the recommendation of next steps. Compliance historically was all about reporting and was all about identification and prevention. But I think compliance is going to have a much more advisory capacity to senior management and to the board of directors here, especially as economies begin to restart. However, I do think that regulators will still see challenges. We do see regulatory deficiencies between borders, for example, and that's why we're seeing a lot of cross-border compliance violations and a lot of cross-border restrictions. There's a lot of penalty gaps. For example, one country will have significant penalties, whereas another one will be much lighter. For example, if I look at certain havens like, your Cyprus of the world, Cayman Islands, Barbados, Bermuda, they have seen a significant push, Curacao, the Dutch Caribbean as well, significant push towards stronger compliance, but there are still penalty gaps in these jurisdictions compared to other economies like, Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like the US, like the UK, that are really pushing a lot stronger enforcement. Political influence. So some countries, of course, have unfortunately increased risk of government corruption, lack of separation between the executive and the judicial branches of government, for instance, which are all things that we talk about over the course. Of course, there's resource inadequacies as well. So how can we help and position your business to tackle these inadequacies? And as a result, how can we be sure that there is no public trust breakdown? If we have people starting to say that, the system doesn't work, they're going to have skepticism. We're going to have exaggerated compliance failure outcomes of each of the previous 4 challenges as well. And these are things that we have to look at as we move into an economic relaunch. So there are a couple of major updates that I think are relevant to the GCC that happened pre-COVID that I think will accelerate even further as economies begin to restart. And there are 3 major things that I want to look at. First is from a regulatory standpoint. So we have much more stringent KYC and AML requirements, particularly in KSA, UAE, and Kuwait. We're seeing a big push in Azerbaijan as well, and in Oman. Big push with some of the royal decrees coming out of Oman as well. We have the Financial Action Task Force reviews. So one thing that I really like seeing this year, in 2019 and early 2020, there were inspections in the KSA and in the UAE, and there were 40 recommendations that the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is a UN associated organization, recommended. And out of the 40 recommendations, the UAE and the KSA had all 40 at least some level of compliance. There was a 40 out of 40 hit for at least some level of compliance, and that was beating countries like the US, for example, that are not even as strong with that blanket compliance that some countries in the GCC region are. So I was very happy to see that. We're also seeing a consolidation of financial institutions across the GCC. We're seeing several banks are fragmented and now they're kind of buying each other out. This is the same with commodity organizations. This is the same with oil and gas companies as well. We're seeing a big push towards acquisition, and as a result, I think this is just going to accelerate as companies recover post-COVID. And the big thing here that really pushes compliance to be a strategic imperative is a view to digitization. Of course, we're seeing non-traditional competitors, more emerging, more disruptive competitors come into play. And I think the more that we look at compliance like a strategic view, the more that we're going to involve digitization into play here. How can we leverage digital tools and new technology tools to improve the compliance function overall? I do think a strong post-pandemic response is going to depend on a few changes to the compliance officer responsibility. So historically, it was all about having identification of a knowledge gap and how do we develop the compliance plan and review it, and of course report to the board. But I think more and more, we're going to see the compliance function interacting with regulators. We're seeing SAMA, for example, making a huge push in the kingdom to work directly with compliance compliance functions to make inspections easier and to reduce the risk of any infractions. I think we're going to see an increased push towards collaboration with the audit function and crisis management, but also an active strategic participation in regulatory updates. So I don't necessarily mean from a lobbying perspective, but I do think that compliance officers are going to sit on trade associations that will directly collaborate with regulators to shape the changes in the regulatory environment post-COVID-19. So one of the things that I'm asked every time I give this course is, okay, well, there's so many things that are happening post-COVID-19. How can we be sure that our organization is prepared, and what frameworks can we look at for guidance here? And the framework that really was the gold standard for the past decade or so, I like to think, is ISO 19600. And I like ISO 19600 because it demonstrates the benefits for small companies, but also for large companies as well. And we have a whole, we can spend days talking about this standard here, but I do want to point out a couple of benefits of ISO 19600 compliance and why I think you should all take the CCP course. Of course, because it's an international framework, it helps gain regulatory confidence, and it also demonstrates why companies regularly need to update and modify their understanding of their compliance environment. Not just the rules and the regulations, but really how does the compliance environment as a whole change in my organization, in my sector, and in my jurisdiction. ISO 19600 puts compliance requirements at the center of risk management, so it really forces that collaboration between the compliance function and the risk management function. And it also helps develop a compliance culture, both at the employee level, right? Compliance is everyone's responsibility, but also at the board level. And finally, what I like about 19600 is that it is easily adaptable and it is easily implementable. I have not seen it be an expensive standard to implement, but it does provide, excuse me, a strong view and a image and a perception of a strong compliance function in the eyes of the regulator, in the eyes of the industry, and in the eyes of the public, for example. I do want to say that 19600 is already going to be replaced by 37301, and 37301 was supposed to be released, or a draft was released in June, I believe, of 2020. Was supposed to be revised in September. Now January, is now February. We're still waiting for the new standard here. But 37301 is going to be a certifiable model, and I think there's going to be a lot of really good changes here. And there's going to be a governance component, a whistleblower component, for example, that current standards from the ISO do not target. Now, we speak about regulatory inventory as well during the course, so looking at understanding what the requirements are, but also how those requirements change based on the location and based on the business function. How do we perform a risk and controls assessment, and how do we identify each what could go wrong to assess if these controls are actually in place? How do we develop an accountability framework? How do we be sure that we're assigning responsibilities effectively to people and empowering them to execute those controls? And of course, how do we monitor the entire system for cracks and for improvements there? And I think all of that really comes down to the third major objective here of building a compliance culture. So we'll continue for about 10 or 15 more minutes, but I do want to make sure that we have ample time for questions and answers at the end. So I do encourage you all, please write your questions in the chat. Happy to go through your questions. And I do want to say, thank you all once again for being here. For those of you that need to drop off at 6 o'clock. KSA time, 10 o'clock in the morning where I am. So we always talk about the tone at the top, right? And a couple of major case studies that I like to bring in. I like to start with Volkswagen. So in September 2015 or so, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA in the US, had identified that VW had installed a defeat device, which was a software that allowed their diesel cars to know, the computer knew when it was being tested, and as a result, the emissions that the car was showing on the computer were less than what the real emissions were. And this was done particularly because Volkswagen wanted to enter the Californian market, who had extremely significant rules related to environment and greenhouse gas emissions, for example. And here in 2015, the investors of Volkswagen obviously, had a panic, and the stock took a significant dive when the company said that they're going to set $7 billion to address the issue. But in 2020, the scandal actually ended up costing closer to 33 billion US dollars in fines, in penalties, in settlements, and in buybacks of vehicles that have lost their value here. And I would say that this probably is even going to increase further, particularly in the European Union, where these vehicles are still on the road and it's still legal to drive these cars here. The other case study that is a bit sadder and is quite tragic is the Boeing 737 MAX 8 and the Boeing 737 MAX 9 event. And in March 2019 or so, all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft around the world. About, I think it's like 380 aircraft or so, 390 aircraft around the world with that model were grounded after there was a crash from an Ethiopian Airlines flight that killed 157 people. And 5 months before that, there was a Lion Air crash as well, where 189 people were killed. And CNN here reported that Boeing admitted that it knew about the problem of the 737 MAX aircraft about a year before it was involved in those two crashes, but it didn't take any action. It's quite a significant, I think, demonstration of a lack of a compliance culture. And you see this being a tragic result. And it's important to not just look at this from a, how can I be sure that we're not going to get caught? Rather, how can I be sure that I'm maximizing my values-led mindset? How can I be sure that the compliance function is going to be a culture that is resounding across the entire organization here? And the third case study that I want to look at here is the compliance culture with Wells Fargo. For those of you that might have seen Wells Fargo, for example, problems began when the executives were pressuring the branch staff, for example, to maximize the sales and the opening of new accounts. And as a result, we saw several branches across the United States that were opening 5, 6, 7, 8 accounts for one particular customer, and they were opening accounts in the names of people that were deceased. People were taking credit cards without even having a signature of the customer. They were just taking out credit cards on their own accord, and as a result, there was a huge fine, $3 billion that Wells Fargo needed to pay here. And this is really from the fact that it goes back to tone at the top. There was a tone of growth, of maximization of profits. And as a result, there wasn't as strong of a compliance culture, in my opinion, at these organizations here. FIFA as well, for those of us who follow football, there was a huge compliance probe as well. FIFA officials were accused of taking all kinds of bribes and kickbacks and bribes to allocate and to award the World Cup, for example, in certain countries. And they were accused of about $150 million of fraud here. Again, another example of a lack of a compliance culture. And it comes down to this comic that I like to show, this cartoon here. So here's the boss, and this is like the office worker, Dilbert, in this comic strip, the Dilbert comic strip. And so the boss comes up to him and says, "Have you taken the mandatory training for business ethics?" And then the employee says, "No, but if you say that I did, then you'll save money on training that you can spend to decorate your office." And so the boss says, "Well, luckily I haven't taken the training myself." And the employee says, "Well, I heard it's mostly common sense anyway." And everybody looks at the compliance function and looks at ethics and looks at trusts and look at compliance from a strategic imperative standpoint and think to themselves, look, it's common sense. We got to follow the rules. We have to follow the law. But at the end of the day, we're seeing a significant push to why compliance is everybody's responsibility here. It's everyone's responsibility to make sure that the compliance function is operating properly. It is everyone's responsibility to, if you see something, say something. And it's everyone's responsibility to help a business maintain their reputation, maintain their brand, and still be compliant in every instance here. And that's why building a compliance culture takes the entire team working together, starting with leadership, aligning compliance with risk management, training people, incentivizing ethical behavior, and most importantly, not ignoring compliance risks when they do come about. So we also speak about during the CCP course that everybody sits in the compliance function, from the board to senior management to the chief compliance officer, the CCO, to the other compliance officers. And their roles are going to change, particularly after COVID-19. But I think what I want to end the session today with is, what can you take away from this webinar that you can implement today in your organization? What are some of the quick wins that compliance officers are able to take today to strengthen their compliance function, especially as your organization prepares for a post-COVID relaunch? First, I really recommend you formalize a policy for government partnerships. As companies begin their economic relaunch, we have several organizations that are going to be collaborating with government entities, with government personnel, totally legitimate functions, but there needs to be a policy in place to deal with these types of partnerships here. And we're seeing several organizations are unfortunately falling behind here. You need to eliminate blurred lines when dealing with governments and dealing with regulators. Second, refuse and report inappropriate requests, especially if you have several branches. If you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, if you're a commodities trader, if you're an exchange office, you don't want to have an example where a customer goes to branch number 1. I speak to the employee says no. Okay, I'm going to go to branch number 2, and that employee says yes. There needs to be a consistent framework for refusing and reporting inappropriate requests. Engage legal counsel, right? When in doubt, reach out. If you're not sure about something, make sure that there's a policy in place that allows your employees to collaborate directly with your legal personnel. That could be through a whistleblower policy. That could be through regular training in collaboration with the legal function, for instance. Promote collaboration between the compliance team and the sales team. I get the comment all the time that, compliance, risk management, internal audit, we're police. You're not police. You are a strategic police officer. And I want to help you eliminate the stigma of internal police here. And part of that is training your business development people today. Compliance changes every single day, and salespeople, business development people, and other people across your organization need to remain informed. Now, that's all the content that I wanted to cover over the course of the webinar today. I do want to quickly go into the topics that we cover in the Certified Compliance Professional course. We see here, for example, in day 1, we speak about global compliance trends. So we'll look at an overview of the global regulatory environment. We'll look at the role of compliance within an organization and what are some of the gold standards. So we have, 2 or 3 hours or so looking at ISO 19600, not just one slide, and how the new ISO standard 37301 will impact how companies approach their compliance framework. We look at cross-border compliance obstacles, some of which we spoke about today, and we look at common reporting standards, and not just, for example, the CRS out of the UK, which is related to tax avoidance, but other cross-border reporting standards that we can be sure help empower your organization to build a stronger compliance function. On day 2, we double click on that compliance function from a culture perspective and a tone at the top perspective. So we look at that values-led mindset. We look at corporate governance versus risk compliance. Governance versus risk versus compliance. So from a GRC methodology, we look at some of frameworks for accountability, independent compliance assessments. So how could you collaborate? Yes, with regulators, but also with external compliance certifiers, for example, like certain consulting firms, for example, to help make sure that you are compliant and that you are assessed as, check, I am indeed in compliance. And then, of course, we look at corporate maturity as well. And there's not one model, I would say, for corporate maturity. So we present a few of them, but it starts from all the way from the foundational training all the way to enablement and empowerment at the top. On day 3, we look at the Office of the CCO, the Chief Compliance Officer, and the CRMO, the Chief Risk Management Officers. So we look at it from an organizational structure standpoint and the roles of the board and management and internal and external audit. As a former auditor myself, I get all excited when we talk about audit. How do we build a compliance risk inventory? Building a compliance monitoring program. So we provide certain frameworks here that will allow you to have a good starting point, but also to help monitor compliance throughout the supply chain. So we speak about third-party risk management, similar to like what we did today, for example. On day 4, we speak about financial crime, always an exciting topic. So we speak about crime versus fraud. What is anti-money laundering versus anti-terrorism financing? What are some of the frameworks that we can implement in our organizations today to identify suspicious activity? Of course, how do we identify, prevent, and tackle bribery, corruption, insider trading, and market manipulation? And what can we have a view on in terms of trade-based money laundering as well, over under invoicing, for example, over under shipping, etc. And then finally, we look at information security risk management. And I think this is probably the most relevant topic of the course because of COVID-19. There's so many more pushes around the world for data privacy, for example, GDPR, cookie management, consent frameworks, for example. And it's important for us to have a view and to understand what these rules are and how they impact your business, your industry, and your jurisdiction. We also speak about cyber attacks and data sensitivity. So what's personal information, what's sensitive information? How can we set information security policies? And of course, how do we increase our cyber protection in the age of e-commerce? And I think this is probably the most relevant today, because if you look at the rise of online transactions over the past year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a huge push in that direction there. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is all that I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to be sure that we had some time to speak about questions and answers if you have any, so please continue to put them in the chat. I will say, just because of the number of people that we have here, please use the chat function as everyone is on mute. So send those questions in the chat. I see that we have some questions already. So let me get the questions how can let me get here. Okay. So we got a couple of really good questions here. We see, okay, so I have a question here. What we really face during the implementation of compliance procedures is a lack of business owners aware of the importance of such a tool. I completely agree. Compliance is still not taken seriously for some business owners who prefer to focus on making a profit and managing their business in their own way. While some business owners see one side of the compliance procedure that focus on the financial analysis and observations, when the technical and administrative part is overlooked. I completely agree. There is a huge push, especially in the last 2 years or so, to provide everybody with these compliance tools and to provide a 360 view of why compliance is important here, because you're absolutely right. We're seeing in the past where it was all about maximizing profits and maximizing our business development and our targets. And as a result, we were focusing on the financial analysis and trying to detect suspicious transactions. But there's a huge technical component. There's tools and softwares that can be used. There's regulatory technologies. There's GRC frameworks and softwares that can be used. And there's the administrative part that is indeed overlooked here. There's a follow-up question here. As you previously said, Mr. Michael, compliance is a culture that all should have within them. But how do we convince business owners with the importance of compliance when he loves the money and focuses his sights only on the functions that generate him dollars? I completely agree, and I will go back to my favorite slide of this presentation here. I'm going to go to, I'm going to go back to this slide here. How do I convince them? I convince them in these two slides. Number one, compliance is good for business. 88% of consumers are not going to want to do business with a company if they believe that that company is not being respectful of ethics guidelines or I just went on mute. Sorry about that. People are not going to want to do business with you. And if you don't believe me, look at any of the case studies that we looked at. We can look at Volkswagen, we can look at Wells Fargo, we can look at Boeing, we can look at FIFA, we can look at Westpac, PayPal. There's all kinds of HSBC. There's all kinds of businesses that we've seen in the past where if you don't think compliance is important, if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. And I am a data guy. I like using the data. And this is what I look at. I look at ethical companies, compliant companies overall raise 13.5% premiums for their investors than the large cap index. If you don't think that is a good enough argument, then it's going to be very difficult to convince that business owner. You have to look at it from the data. If you don't want to spend money on compliance, look at it from your investor standpoint. Look how much more money you will make if you have a compliance function and if you have an ethical culture across the organization here. So that's how I would answer your question. I would say there needs to be an ethical view, there needs to be a compliant view, and as a result, you will have more money in the long run. You will have a 13.5% premium, at least in the past 5 years or so, compared to the regular large cap index here. So I really appreciate that question. I think that's extremely relevant. I think that's even going to be more relevant as companies start to restart post COVID-19 here. Are there any other questions in the meantime? Okay, we have one more question here. It is quite easy to change workers or middle management culture and pass messages, but when it comes to alert top management about the key or high-rated risk, it becomes more difficult, definitely. How would you say is the best way to pass and put emphasis on such messages? My number one recommendation that I like to make to clients that have, because I think this is absolutely a very relevant question, and I think it's a significant challenge. It's a significant challenge because if you are a top manager, you're going to put a rule in place, you're going to put a policy, and the lower level employees, they're going to follow it. They have to follow it. But how do we get the top management? How do we get that tone at the top to be a participant here? There are two major things that I would recommend that companies can do in the short term. First, comes from a collaborative approach between compliance that reports directly to the board of directors rather than reporting to senior management. And the reason for that is because if the compliance function reports directly to the board or to the audit committee or to the governance committee, for example, then they're able to make recommendations to the board, and then the board is able to make those requirements for senior management. That's number one. We're seeing a big push away from the traditional compliance model of having compliance sit under legal and have compliance sit under risk, and now sitting more under the board directly, number one. Number two, I always like to recommend compliance literacy. I know we always speak about training and training and training. I think training is the most important tool to build your compliance pyramid. If you are able to provide training, not just to your lower level management, but to your senior management, that is when it's going to become extremely impactful. I would say the majority of the people that I train are chief officers. So the chief financial officer, chief executive officers, chief compliance officers, chief risk, chief marketing. These are a lot of the people that like to take this course because they're recognizing the importance of, look, we know compliance is an important function, but we don't really know why I should be super involved or really being a champion for compliance. And so one of the things that I like to look at is training those senior leaders to become a champion of compliance here. So thank you very much for that question. I think that's extremely relevant, particularly in light of the COVID relaunch. There's another question here. How about inducing BOD members in not-for-profit organizations to adopt compliance risk management, who they are driven by, not driven by profit making? I completely agree as well. I sit on several boards of directors here in Canada, as well as some educational institutions as well, certain universities here, and I like to look at. I like to look at it from the perspective of, you know, just because you are a not-for-profit company doesn't mean you can't have a strong compliance model. What do I mean exactly? Yes, for-profit companies are, of course, motivated by profit, and the compliance argument is you need to balance trust and you need to balance compliance, of course. But in a not-for-profit scenario that might not be driven by profit, you might still want to be able to manage your organizational risk, your reputational risk, because if you don't and you're not for profit, you might lose donors. You might not be subject to certain government grants that you depend on to finance your business. You might not be respecting the obligations that you have towards your members, for example, towards your membership. So that would be how I would like to say, yes, BODs of for-profit companies need to have a view to compliance, but boards of not-for-profit companies need to have a view of compliance as well. Another question here, Mr. Paul, can you recommend a compliance maturity model on how we can measure our organization maturity quantitatively? I think that's, so I get that question a lot. I don't like to say that there's one particular maturity model that I like to look at, but I do look at certain elements for guidance. You can look at things like the U.S. Department of Justice guidelines, the EOCCP, evaluation of corporate compliance programs. You can look at ISO 37301 or the old 19600 because that's flexible, that's scalable. You can look at the UK Serious Fraud Office, for example, OFAC, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's several frameworks that you can use. In terms of quantifying risk management, quantifying compliance maturity is something that we actually tackled during the course. So I do provide certain softwares, for example, that I like to use that help manage risk and quantify risk with really a number to see where we can focus on first. And second, providing tools that will allow you to benchmark your maturity, not just to your organization and to your aspirations, to your maturity goals, but also how can you benchmark it to the rest of your industry here. Okay, so very, very good question as well, very relevant. I don't see any more questions. I want to thank everybody on behalf of myself, on behalf of the entire team at LEORON. I work in consulting. I do this every day, and I teach because I absolutely love teaching. I love hearing your questions. I love learning from you. I like hearing your perspectives and learning from your experiences. I think that makes it even more impactful for me as a trainer. So I want to thank you all so much for your time. And at this point, I'd like to pass it back to my colleague, Angela, to give a few final concluding words here. Angela, are you still with us?
Yes, dear. Thank you so much to all of you for attending the webinar. And yes, I believe that you are all satisfied. Thank you so much, Michael.
Great. Thank you very much. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact any of the team members at LEORON, and we will, of course, be happy to answer your questions or to put you in contact with someone that we know will be able to perfectly answer your questions here. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you a very lovely evening and a pleasant and safe rest of the week. I hope you and your families are keeping safe and keeping healthy during the pandemic, and that everyone is staying safe. And hopefully we'll meet again very soon. I wish you all a very pleasant rest of the evening. Goodbye.